this time you challenged us with a fascinating deep dive. Insidious, The Red Door.
Okay.
A film that promises to tie together the mythology of the Insidious franchise,
Right.
while delving even deeper into the psychological complexities of the Lambert family.
Yeah.
Let's see if it delivers on that promise. You've given us a ton to unpack,
Yeah.
from articles analyzing the film to comparisons with others in the genre.
Right.
Where should we begin?
Well, I think what's really fascinating about this film
Yeah.
and the franchise in general, I think, is this blend of supernatural thrills and genuine explorations of trauma.
Right?
It's The Red Door isn't just about jump scares.
Yeah.
You know, it uses those elements to kind of get under your skin and make
Right.
you think about the lasting impact of fear
Yeah.
and the things we choose to bury.
Yeah, it's giving more elevated horror than your typical haunted house story.
Right.
We see this trend reflected in a lot of your sources, actually.
Yeah.
Drawing comparisons to films like The Babadook and Hereditary,
Yeah.
where the real horror is often rooted in family dynamics,
Yes.
and the monsters reflect something deeper.
Exactly. And with The Red Door being the fifth film in the franchise,
Right.
it's not just building on those themes, it's directly confronting
Right.
the events of the first two Insidious films.
Yeah.
Remember, those introduced us to this terrifying realm known as the Further, where spirits and demons can interact with the living world.
Right.
It's not just a haunted house.
Yeah.
It's a whole dimension of fear.
And at the heart of that, literally and figuratively,
Yeah.
we have the Lambert family.
Right.
Would you say that at its core, this franchise is about their experiences with the supernatural
Yeah.
and how those experiences have shaped them?
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. The first two films centered around Dalton,
Right.
the youngest Lambert,
Okay.
and his terrifying ability to astral project.
Right.
He wasn't just a kid wandering into the wrong room.
Yeah.
He could literally separate his spirit from his body.
Right.
And that's how he ended up in the Further in the first place.
Poor kid.
I know.
Talk about childhood trauma.
Right.
But it gets even more complicated than that, right? Because Dalton wasn't the only one with this ability.
Exactly. Insidious Chapter 2 revealed that Dalton's father, Josh,
Right.
could also astral project.
Ah.
Turns out it was a hereditary ability
Wow.
passed down from his mother.
Okay.
And Josh's own childhood encounter with the Further adds another layer of complexity to the family's history
Right.
with the supernatural.
It wasn't just a one-time scare for him either.
No.
Our notes suggest that Josh was specifically targeted by a malevolent entity, the Bride in Black.
And that's where the franchise's exploration of trauma really comes into play, right?
Huh.
What happened to Josh as a child didn't just disappear.
Right.
It manifested in this terrifying entity that sought to possess him.
Yeah.
It's almost like a physical manifestation of his deepest fears,
Right.
the things he tried to bury.
And of course, those repressed traumas don't stay buried forever.
No, they don't.
Which is why Chapter 2 ends with Josh succumbing to the Bride in Black's influence and terrorizing his own family.
It's like the ultimate horror movie twist on family drama.
Right.
But even then, it doesn't end there.
Right.
The film tries to offer a sense of closure
Okay.
by having Josh and Dalton undergo a process to repress their memories of the Further.
A seemingly happy ending, but anyone familiar with the horror genre knows that repressed memories rarely stay repressed.
Exactly.
Which brings us to The Red Door, where we're thrust back into the lives of the Lambert family 10 years later.
Yes. And this time, it's not just Dalton who's haunted by the past.
Right.
Josh is struggling too, grappling with these fragmented memories and a strained relationship with his son.
Okay.
The trauma they tried to bury has resurfaced,
Yeah.
driving a wedge between them.
So we're not just picking up the story, we're picking up the pieces of
Yeah.
a family fractured by their experiences.
Yeah.
And looming over it all, both literally and metaphorically, is the image of the Red Door.
It's the entry point to the Further, sure.
Right.
But it represents something much deeper. Think of it as the barrier between the conscious and unconscious mind.
Okay.
What we choose to hide, what we try to forget, it all lurks behind that red door,
Right.
waiting for the right moment to break free.
This is already sounding less like a typical haunted house story and more like a psychological thriller.
Yes.
What do you think? Is that where the Red Door really sets itself apart?
I think so, yeah.
Using horror to explore the complexities of memory and the lasting impact of trauma, It feels like the film is intentionally blurring those lines
Yeah.
between the supernatural and the psychological.
Right.
We're seeing this in Dalton's story, especially with his art becoming this outlet, this window into his subconscious.
It's a fascinating way to visualize the return of repressed memories.
Okay.
Dalton, now an art student,
Right.
is channeling these vivid nightmares into his paintings.
Yeah.
And guess what keeps appearing?
Let me guess, the red door.
Yeah.
It's almost too perfect.
Right. It's like on a deeper level, even without consciously remembering,
Right.
he's still drawn to that image, that symbol of the trauma he experienced in the further.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting. His paintings aren't just reflecting his past.
Okay.
They seem to be predicting the future.
Wait, his art is showing things before they happen?
Yeah.
That's straight out of a Stephen King novel? Are we talking about premonitions?
It's one of the ways the film blurs those lines between the real and the supernatural.
Right.
Dalton's art becomes this bridge, this visual representation
Right.
of how trauma can manifest in unpredictable, uncontrollable ways.
Yeah, you start to question what's a genuine premonition?
Right.
What's a subconscious fear bubbling to the surface? And
Right.
what's just plain old bad luck?
Exactly.
And as if Dalton unwittingly painting these premonitions wasn't enough,
Yeah.
we have Josh experiencing his own fragmented memories,
Right.
his own pull back toward
Yeah, we're
It's like they're both being drawn back to that point of origin,
Yeah.
that shared trauma, but in their own ways.
It's a parallel journey, absolutely.
Mhm.
And this is where the film's exploration of family dynamics comes back into play.
Okay.
Josh, struggling to connect with his son
Right.
to make amends for the past, is forced to confront the reality
Yeah.
that those repressed memories have had a profound impact on both of them.
Right.
They're both haunted,
Yeah.
but they're also in this together.
It's giving Shakespearean tragedy, but with demons and jump scares.
Right.
And speaking of demons, we have to talk about the lipstick face demon.
Yes.
He's become almost as iconic to the Insidious franchise as Freddy Krueger is to Nightmare on Elm Street.
Right.
What is it about this particular entity that makes him so terrifying?
Well, I mean, it's not just the creepy appearance,
Right.
though that certainly adds to it.
Sure.
The lipstick-faced demon is often interpreted as the embodiment of repressed trauma,
Okay.
the way it can fester and distort, becoming something monstrous.
So he's not just a scary monster.
Right.
He's a symbol of the very thing that Josh and Dalton are trying to escape,
Exactly.
the consequences of burying their pain.
Yeah,
That adds a whole other level of fear to the film.
absolutely.
Right.
And notice how the film uses the lipstick-faced demon.
Okay.
He's not just randomly jumping out.
Right?
He often appears in moments of heightened emotion, vulnerability,
Okay.
when the characters are forced to confront their deepest fears.
It's like he feeds off those negative emotions, those
Yeah.
unresolved traumas.
Right.
He represents the danger of not confronting those inner demons.
Exactly.
But it's not just the lipstick-faced demon that carries that symbolic weight.
Right.
You mentioned earlier that the film is full of visual motifs,
Yeah.
things that operate on multiple levels.
Right.
What else should we be paying attention to?
Keep an eye out for spirals.
Okay.
You see them everywhere in Dalton's artwork.
Okay.
In the way certain scenes are shot.
Okay.
They represent this cyclical nature of trauma.
Okay.
How it can trap you in these repeating patterns.
Right.
Generation after generation.
It's like a visual representation of that phrase, history repeats itself,
Right.
but in a much more sinister way.
Exactly.
We're not just talking about making the same mistakes, we're
Yeah.
talking about being pulled back into these dark traumatic experiences.
Exactly.
And don't forget about mirrors.
Oh, yeah.
They're everywhere in the Red Door,
Right.
constantly reflecting the characters back at themselves, but also distorting their reflections.
Yes.
They symbolize that fragmented sense of self that often comes with trauma.
Right.
That feeling of not knowing who you are or what's real anymore.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's interesting, you don't necessarily pick up on these details during those heart-pounding moments.
Right.
But they add this whole other layer to the viewing experience.
Right.
You start to see how intentional the filmmakers were with their choices.
Yeah.
How much thought went into crafting this atmosphere of dread.
And it's not just about creating a creepy mood. It's about reflecting the internal states of the characters.
Right,
They're not just battling demons in the country.
right.
Further, they're battling their own inner demons, their own psychological scars.
It's a brilliant way to elevate the horror genre,
Yeah.
to make it about something more than just jump scares and gore.
Right.
But even with all the symbolism, all this talk about trauma and family dynamics, the red door still manages to deliver on the action.
It does.
We've got astral projection. We've got demon confrontations. We've got that whole terrifying world of the further to contend with.
Right, it's a balancing act.
Yeah.
And the film, for the most part, manages to pull it off.
Right.
It gives you those edge-of-your-seat moments, those classic horror thrills.
Yeah.
But it also leaves you with something to think about.
Sure.
Long after the credits roll.
It's not just about escaping the haunted house.
Right.
It's about escaping the horrors of the past.
Yes.
And sometimes those can be the hardest to outrun. Speaking of those who have been through a lot, we can't forget about the rest of the Lambert family. They've been through the ringer with all of this.
Oh, yeah.
Is there anything in your research about how the Red Door portrays those often overlooked family members?
There's definitely a focus on Josh and Dalton.
Right.
As the ones directly connected to the further.
Right.
But the film doesn't completely sideline the other characters.
Okay.
Take Foster, for instance, the middle child, who often gets overlooked.
He always seemed like the most well-adjusted one.
Right.
The one who somehow escaped the family curse.
Exactly. And while he might not have the same supernatural experiences as his brother and father, the Red Door hints at the toll their trauma has taken on him.
Because even if you're not the one directly experiencing something, living in the shadow of that trauma can have its own impact.
Absolutely.
It can be easy to overlook those less obvious forms of suffering.
It can.
And then we have Chris, Dalton's college roommate. She brings a different energy to the film.
Yeah.
A much-needed dose of humor and lightheartedness.
Right.
Which is interesting because you wouldn't think humor would have a place in a film like this.
Right.
But it actually works.
It does.
It reminds you that even in the darkest of times,
right,
even when facing your demons, having that support system, that person who can make you smile, can make all the difference.
It speaks to the power of friendship, of having someone outside the family who can offer a fresh perspective and a sense of normalcy. Someone who can remind you that you're not alone in your struggles.
And of course, we can't forget about Renite, the mother trying to hold her family together. She's the one who's always had to be strong. The one who's had to pick up the pieces when everything falls apart.
She represents resilience. That unwavering love and support that families need to navigate trauma. And what's interesting is in the Red Door, we see her grappling with her own guilt and grief. Her own sense of responsibility for what her family has endured.
Because how can you not blame yourself? Even if it's not your fault. When you're a parent, you want to protect your children from everything. And when you can't, that can leave some deep wounds.
They can.
So even though the Red Door focuses on Josh and Dalton's journey back to the further, it also expands the narrative to explore how trauma ripples outward, impacting everyone in its wake.
And it does so without losing sight the supernatural elements that make the Insidious franchise so compelling.
It's a delicate balance.
It is.
But one that the Red Door seems to achieve. It gives you those heart-pounding scares. But it also makes you think. Makes you feel. And maybe even makes you want to hug your loved ones a little tighter.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of stories, even in the face of unimaginable horrors, there's always hope. Always the potential for healing and connection.
Speaking of healing and connection, does that sense of hope extend to the resolution of the film? Can the Lambert family finally close the Red Door on their traumatic past? Or is there a sense of those echoes lingering, those wounds never fully healing?
That's the question that lingers after the credits roll, isn't it? And it's interesting, you've given me sources that wrestle with those very ideas. Some critics argue that the Red Door offers a more optimistic ending compared to the previous films. There's a sense of closure, of the family coming together to face their demons, both literally and metaphorically.
They confront those repressed memories. They literally venture back into the further to battle these entities. And they emerge, if not unscathed, at least stronger, more connected.
Exactly. And visually, we see that reflected in the image of the Red Door finally closing.
Other analyses argue that this sense of closure might be superficial.
I mean...
That even though the door is shut, the scars remain.
Trauma doesn't just disappear. It can leave these invisible marks that shape how you interact with the world. How you relate to those closest to you.
It's almost like the film is acknowledging that the past is always present in some way.
Yeah, you can't just erase it
or
pretend it never happened. It becomes a part of who you are.
Which I think is where The Red Door really succeeds. It doesn't offer easy answers or tie everything up with a neat little bow. It recognizes the complexity of trauma, the way it can reverberate through generations. And it leaves us to ponder those implications.
It's a reminder that healing is a process, not a destination. And even when you think you've confronted your demons, there might be others lurking in the shadows.
Maybe that's what makes it such an effective horror film. It taps into that primal fear, not just of the things that go bump in the night, but of the darkness that resides within us. The secrets we keep, the wounds we try to hide.
It's the kind of film that stays with you long after you've seen it. You're left thinking about your own experiences, your own family history, the things you might be choosing to ignore.
It makes you wonder, like, what doors have I closed in my own life? And are they truly shut? Or just waiting for the right moment to creak open again?
That's the power of a film like The Red Door. It uses the supernatural as a metaphor for the very real and often terrifying complexities of the human experience.
Well, there you have it. Insidious. The Red Door is a film that promises closure to the Lambert family's terrifying saga, but ultimately reminds us that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we carry within.
And that sometimes the bravest act isn't running away from the darkness, but turning to face it, even if it means opening a door you thought you had locked forever.
That's a good place to leave it.
Another insightful deep dive.
Thank you. Thanks to our expert for joining us.
Of course, my pleasure.
And until next time, keep exploring those dark corners.